The time is at hand.
The elusive dog-like creature attacks livestock, bleeding them dry of blood.
8 to 10 feet tall, shadowy aliens.
But I am telling you right now,
we need a great reset.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen.
Welcome to In Dark Places. I'm your Huckleberry, Jumbo Fugit. It's getting warm outside, warmer than usual thanks to all the weather modification. I'm trying to convince people that climate change is real. Good times. And our air conditioner has been kind of dead again. We go through this just about every year. Had to get Freon put in the air conditioner. I had a guy look at it a couple years ago. He said, yeah, this kind of unit usually lasts you about 7 years. And I said, this one is 11 years old. And he said, well, it's about time for you to get a new one. So I see big money changes coming soon. As if I didn't have enough bills to pay for and junk. But I've been taking advantage of the warm weather. Been out working in the garden, getting everything all set up and ready. And having fun.
This is Mr. Haunted with some In Dark Places breaking news. Woman claims she received stolen Jeep as a birthday tip from Waffle House customer, police say, out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. A woman in Oklahoma claimed the vehicle she is accused of stealing was a birthday tip from a former Waffle House customer, police said. According to the Tulsa Police Department, officers received a tip about a stolen white Jeep Liberty on April 1st. Officers were able to stop the Jeep and speak with the driver, who they identified as Angela Harrison. Harrison told officers that she was at a gas station an hour earlier where she ran into a former customer of hers when she worked at Waffle House. She told police the man gave her $10 cash and the Jeep as a gift because her 53rd birthday is coming up in a few weeks. However, that Jeep was reported stolen before Christmas, police said. Detectives also had a photo of Harrison driving the Jeep from January 14th. Harrison identified herself in the photo, but she could not explain why she was driving the Jeep on January 14th after she claimed the vehicle was gifted to her only an hour before. Harrison was arrested and charged with possession of a stolen vehicle. Tulsa police said the owner of the Jeep died last year. The vehicle was returned to his family. And there is some breaking news. Back to you, Junebug.
There's Jimmy Pitnito, Mr. Haunted. Thank you, sir. Monolith mystery reemerges in Wales, prompting speculation of space aliens. By Bill Hutchinson. Thanks, Bill. A newly discovered 10-foot-tall silver monolith on a muddy bluff in Wales has reignited speculation on its origin after similar obelisks appeared in Utah, California, England, and Romania. The shiny spear, impaled in the ground near Hay-on Wye in Powys, Wales, was discovered this month by construction worker Craig Muir while he was out on his regular hike. Muir posted a video of the bizarre find on TikTok saying, "I come up here most days and I've never seen this before." Almost looks like a UFO just put it on the ground. He said that when he first discovered the object atop the roadless 2,221-foot Hay Bluff, he found no tire tracks or footprints around it that could explain a human connection. Since word of the anomalous monolith spread through Wales and England, tourists and news crews have flocked to the bluff to get a look. Muir noted in a March 15th social media video that someone appeared to have hammered dents into what he said had initially been a polished silver facade. Like others that have been discovered, the monolith harkens to those in the plot of movie maker Stanley Kubrick's 1968 science fiction classic 2001: A Space Odyssey. Muir described the statue as appearing to be made of steel, roughly 10 feet tall by a 1.5 feet wide and hollow inside. He also noted that it appears quite hefty, adding to the riddle of how it got there. While some observers of the monolith chalked it up as an elaborate prank, others found the extraterrestrial angle plausible. After posting his videos on the Hayon Y community notice board Facebook page, one person replied, "I quite like the monolith. I hope the aliens don't come and get it too soon." No one has claimed responsibility for placing the monolith on the bluff. The discovery was one of several that have occurred since 2016 around the world.
Why would I be playing this right now? I'll tell you. This week's Cryptid Corner. This one's called Hogzilla. Hogzilla is a giant pig who was shot and killed by a hunter named Chris Griffin in Alapaha, Georgia. Why can't anything be a normal name? On Ken Holyoke's fish farm and hunting reserve. It was a male hybrid of a wild hog and a domestic pig, reported to be over 12 feet long and weighing over 1,000 pounds. It was originally considered a hoax. In March 2005, it was revealed that it was only 800 pounds and was between 7 and 9 feet long. But nevertheless, that is still an enormous size. There is also another pig known as Fred. Hey, Fred! Who was shot and killed by a 12-year-old boy named Jameson Stone on a game reserve that, according to hunters, weighed 1,051 pounds and was 9.4 feet long. The boy used a Smith & Wesson model 550 caliber revolver and shot it 9 times before killing him with a headshot. He was 12 years old. Jameson, what'd you do today? Apparently, the reserve purchased him from a farmer who was selling all of their pigs. The Kersey hog is a hog shot and killed by William Coursey in Fayetteville, Georgia, that weighed over 1,100 pounds. And then there's Hog Kong, who was a giant pig who weighed 1,140 pounds, and he was shot on a farm near Leesburg, Georgia. Big Bill was a pig who broke a leg in Jackson, Tennessee, and he was put down when he weighed 2,552 pounds. He also holds the record for being the largest pig ever. And then there's also a guy named Ton Pig, who was a hog from China, that weighed 1,984 pounds and died from lack of mobility because of obesity. Big Norm was a pig who grew to 1,600 pounds and grew to 8 foot 4 inches. They are no longer considered a cryptid. Well, thanks for telling me now, after I did Cryptid Corner. On freedomarms.com, on the trophy board, a man named Robert Fanucci posted a picture of a wild boar that he killed with his .50 caliber Wyoming Express revolver. And I'm looking at the picture now, but it doesn't help you guys. But I guess that does it for maybe Cryptid Corner. Thank you.
Cryptid Corner. Very scary. This week on the show, we are talking about witches. The very words witch hunt summon up a picture of mindless, hysterical persecution of the innocent, which would aptly describe the ugly events of Salem in the 17th century. Frank Smith describes the horror. Thanks, Frank. Just after Christmas, 1691, 7 young girls of Salem Village in Essex County, Massachusetts, took up fortune-telling in order to while away the long winter months. They used an egg poured into a wine glass as a crystal ball in an attempt to see their future husbands. Instead, according to Reverend John Hill of nearby Beverly, there came up a coffin, that is, a specter in likeness of a coffin. It was an apt omen. 10 months later, as a direct result of the girls' experiments, the little Puritan community lay devastated. 20 people had been executed for witchcraft, while over 100 more lay in prison. Their property confiscated, and the name of Salem, changed to Danvers in the 20th century, had become a synonym for mindless persecution. As a Boston merchant, Thomas Brattle wrote prophetically, "I am afraid that ages will not wear off, that reproach and those stains which these things will leave behind them upon our land." Compared with the great witch hunts of Europe, that of Salem was insignificant. In the mid-17th century, for instance, an estimated 900 witches had been burned in the city of Bamberg alone, and 500 in the province of Alsace, while in the English county of Essex, from which the Massachusetts district took its name. The witch finder, Matthew Hopkins, had dispatched to the gallows at least twice as many victims that were hung at Salem. Salem's abiding horror lies in the fact that it was the last major instance of a sober, rational, and industrious society riving itself apart literally through fear of the devil. The details of how it did so exist in abundance in voluminous court records, over 50 written confessions, ecclesiastical journals, and contemporary letters. Despite 2 centuries of historical analysis, the reason why the reign of terror took place still remains largely conjectural. When these calamities first began, wrote the Reverend Samuel Parris, which was in my own family, the affliction was several weeks before such hellish operations as witchcraft were suspected. Parris was a minister of Salem Village, and like the majority of Massachusetts clergymen of the time, a Puritan. However, the New England Puritans had, by the 1690s, become a remarkably tolerant and well-balanced society. Ingersoll's Tavern in Salem Village was patronized by clergy and laity alike. People living in sin were frowned upon, but unmolested, and true poverty was almost non-existent. Intellectually, standards were high. Harvard University, on the outskirts of Boston, 15 miles to the south of Salem Village, was founded largely through the efforts of the Reverend Increase Mather, who was to play a prominent adversary part in the witchcraft trials, while Samuel Sewell, one of the Salem judges, was writing his tract, The Selling of Joseph, the first anti-slavery pamphlet published in America. It was to prayer and fasting that the Reverend Parris turned when his 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to throw fits after experimenting with the glass and egg. 5 other girls were also affected, 12-year-old Ann Putnam, and 4 older girls, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mary Warren, and Mercy Lewis, whose ages ranged from 16 to 20. The Reverend Parris wisely removed his daughter and niece to the home of a friend in Salem Town, 5 miles away. The remaining 5 were to form the accusers. Later, the girls suffered hallucinations, seeing spectral figures who beat, scratched, and bit them, often leaving actual marks on their flesh, and struck them temporarily blind, deaf, and dumb. They also suffered loss of appetite and had choking attacks. Reverend Parris finally took the girls to a local doctor, William Griggs, who announced, "The evil hand is upon them." On February 29th, 4 yeomen of Salem Village swore out warrants for the arrest of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. And the following day they were brought before the community's 2 magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin. Hawthorne asked, "Sarah Good, what evil spirits have you familiarity with? Have you made no contract with the devil? Why do you thus torment those poor children?" And so on. In the case of Sarah Good, he may have felt justified, for her own husband, William, testified that he thought she was either a witch or could very well become one quickly because of her bad carriage to him. And her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, claimed that her mother kept black and yellow birds as familiars that hurt the children and afflicted persons. When the girls were asked to face Sarah Good and say whether she was one of their tormentors, they all immediately fell into fits and were dreadfully tortured and tormented for a short space of time. When recovered, they said Good's spectre had come and tormented them, though her body remained at a considerable distance from them. In the cases of the first 3 women, there was little need to convict them on this spectral evidence. Sarah Good, a vicious old woman, according to her husband's testimony, was known to murder under her breath when passing people had annoyed her. Surely she must be reciting curses. Sarah Osborne admitted that she had dreamed of a thing like an Indian all black, which did prick her on the neck. Surely this was the devil marking her for his own. But the evidence of the slave, Tituba, was the most sensational of them all, and opened up a new dimension of unease. It seemed that an organized coven was operating in the neighborhood. She had, she said, met the devil in the shape of a tall black man with white hair. Sometimes he had come in the shape of an animal. He had brought a book and made her place her mark in it like red blood, thus binding her to him for 6 years. There had been marks altogether in the book, 2 or 3 of them made by Good and Osborne, 2 made by the witches of Boston. Both Good and Osborne, she said, had familiars, cats, birds, and a thing with wings and 2 legs and a head like a woman. Most disturbing of all, Osborne had a thing all over Harry, all the face hairy, and a long nose. I don't know how to tell what its face looks like. It had legs and goeth upright like a man, and last night it stood at Mr. Parris's hall. So it's a Bigfoot. The 3 women were committed to jail. Osborne died there on May 10th, and the slave Tituba was left there until she was sold to pay her jailer's fees. The Reverend Parris being too shocked, no doubt, by the revelations of what had gone on in his house to pay them. On July 19th, the malicious Sarah Good along with 4 other women accused of being witches, went to the gallows. As she climbed up the gallows steps, Sarah Good made a prediction that some were to think, in retrospect, proved her guilt. When the Reverend Nicholas Noyes asked her to repent of her witchcraft, she cried out, "You are a liar. I am no more of a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." A quarter of a century later, Noyes suffered a massive lung hemorrhage and choked on his own blood.
Well, that was a very scary song. Have you ever heard of the Island McGee witches? Me neither. But in September 1710, an old widow of a local priest was staying in Nowhead House in the rural region of Island McGee, Ireland. Her stay was plagued by mysterious events, such as invisible hands hurling stones at windows. Household objects disappeared and reappeared, and bedclothes were rearranged in the shape of a corpse. The widow even saw a frightening demonic creature warning her that she would die soon. The apparition was not joking. On February 21st, 1711, the widow died after experiencing a series of stabbing pains in her back. The locals immediately suspected that witches had something to do with the widow's terrible fate after a young girl called Mary Dunbar found a strange apron containing the bonnet of the dead widow. Supernatural events started to happen around her, too. She appeared to be possessed, vomited small household objects like pins and buttons, and even levitated above her bed. After a month of torment, Mary managed to name 8 women from the area as the witches responsible for the events. This was based on the way their spirit images had been visiting her. The local clergy started investigating the case with Edward Clements, the mayor of the nearby Carrickfergus. He was the ancestor of Samuel Clemens, whom you might know better as Mark Twain. The 8 women were taken to court despite their pleas of innocence. There was very little actual proof against them apart from Mary's accusations and eyewitness reports of her convulsions. Even so, the witches were sentenced to a year's imprisonment in a filthy prison because the judge probably wasn't happy about killing witches, especially ones who could apparently visit him in his sleep. The Island McGee witches became one of the creepier stories in the area's folklore. Although modern scholars think that the women were innocent, it's worth noting that their sentences are still in effect. They're still witches in the eyes of history. The Island McGee witches. Very scary.
My uncle's wife told me the story. She's from a small town next to our town in Mexico. She said that one night, past midnight, for some reason she looked out the window in her room. She saw something flying by and made eye contact with it. When she came to realize it was a witch, she panicked and closed the curtains and tried to go back to sleep. She said she usually woke up around 6 a.m. to go to this house where they had cornmeal so she could make handmade tortillas. Hey, there you go. Send me some. Like me some tortillas. When she woke up, She said her head was sticking out the window. Their windows had metal bars, and her head was sticking out. So, I don't know, was it in between the metal bars? That'd be kind of interesting. She believes that the witch that she saw tried to take her, and the only thing that held her back were those metal bars. It was flying by, was it on a broom?
So I was searching for witch songs for the little intros here, and I discovered this song by John Fogerty, never heard of it before, called Wicked Old Witch. And listen to it later, but I'll play a little bit right now.
Shriveled old lady with a tombstone mouth, staring up trouble at the haunted house. Flying across the moon on a big old stick. Everybody prayed to the wicked old witch.
This is called the Northern Moravia Witch Trials. Northern Moravia, a historical area in the Czech Republic, was not a good place for perceived witches in the latter half of the 17th century. During that time, hundreds of women were burned at the stake as witches, and a single witch trial could lead to over 100 executions. One particular tragedy started during a mass when an altar boy saw that an old lady had pocketed her communion bread instead of eating it. Tattletale. Little tattletale. When a priest confronted the woman about this, she explained that she was going to give the bread to her cow to increase its milk production. Holy cow! Get it? Anyway, the priest took this as a sign of witchcraft and alerted a judge who specialized in such cases. Unfortunately, the justice system at the time actually derived revenue from trials. As the judges and courts sentenced more and more people for public burnings, they sustained their income by finding more witches to prosecute and execute. Their methods for finding new victims involved gathering accusations of witchcraft from concerned citizens. No, they're tattletales. And of course, the tried and tested method of prisoner torture. Eventually, the body count grew so high that the area's ruling class started getting concerned. Surely, it was just a matter of time before they or someone they cared about would fall victim to the witch hunt. With all their power, they started putting political pressure on the government to stop the trials. This ultimately happened, and the people of Northern Moravia were left to wonder how on earth they had considered a brutal mass murder for so long.
On a big old stick, everybody prayed to the wicked old witch.
Seems to be a common theme. There's a lot of tattletaling involved in witchcraft. Did 3 women of the Flower family kill the Earl of Rutland's sons through witchcraft in the early 17th century? Or were they themselves victims of an hysterical witch hunt? Frederick Goodman investigates. Thanks, Frederick. In the Church of St. Mary the Virgin at Bottlesford in Leicestershire, there is a tomb that is unique to English art. It is called the Witchcraft Tomb, and is the only English memorial whose inscription claims that the deceased died through witchcraft. The tomb is that of the 6th Earl of Rutland, who died in 1632. The marble monument consists of 3 life-size recumbent images raised on tiers. The topmost effigy is that of Lady Frances, who became the wife of the 6th Earl in 1604, and who bore him a daughter. The center effigy is that of the Earl himself, wearing the court dress appropriate to his rank and the Order of the Garter. At his feet is the family crest of a peacock with spread tail. The effigy on the lowest of these three shelves is that of his second wife, Cecilia Hungerford, whom he married shortly after the death of his first wife in 1608. At the head of the group, kneeling in prayer, is the effigy of his daughter, Catherine, who eventually became the Duchess of Buckingham. At their feet are two effigies of the sons born to him of the Countess Cecilia. Above the group there is a long and somewhat pompous inscription, almost certainly written by the Earl himself, who designed the tomb. This mainly records his travels and honors accorded him on the continent. But it is this inscription that makes the tomb unique, for it reads, "In 1608 he married the Lady Cecilia Hungerford, daughter to the Honorable Knight Sir John Tufton, by whom he had two sons, both which died in their infancy by wicked practice and sorcery." The effigies of these two sons hold skulls. The elder, Henry, holds a skull in his left hand, while the younger, Francis, holds a skull in his right hand. But the symbolical flower that Francis holds in his left hand is a direct reference to the supposed manner of his death, for the surname of the witches who were supposed to have caused it was Flower. The Flower family, a mother and two daughters, worked in the home of the 6th Earl Belvoir Castle. Joan Flower was a kind of general chairwoman, but her daughters, Philippa and Margaret, lived in the castle, the latter looking after the poultry and attending to the laundry. Both servants gained bad reputations, and Margaret was dismissed, although it seems in a kindly manner. Shortly afterward, the elder son of the Earl, Henry, Lord Roos, fell sick and, after a lingering illness, died, to be buried in Bottleford Church in September 1613. Local suspicion insisted that he had died from witchcraft. The three Flower women had some reason for damaging the Earl and his wife, and who already had a reputation for being witches, were arrested in 1617 after the death of the child, and were brought before local magistrates, who included Samuel Fleming, rector of Bottlesford. These gentlemen passed the women on to further examination before justices at Lincoln Jail. Joan Flower never reached Lincoln, for she died in mysterious circumstances on her way to trial. Accounts vary, but some insist that she asked for bread, ate it, and choked. This account corresponds in essence to the popular traditions. It was widely believed that witches could not eat bread. The superstition was linked with the ideal of the sacramental quality of the bread. A witch, possessed by demons or the devil himself, could not take Christ in sacramental form into his or her being. Another account tells the story as though Joan herself were attempting to prove her innocence, and called down upon her the wrath of God. But Joan Flower, before her conviction, called for bread and butter, and wished it might never go through her, if she were guilty of that whereupon she was examined. So, mumbling in her mouth, never spake more words after, but fell down and died with a horrible excruciation of soul and body. Margaret confessed on January 22nd, 1618, during an examination before Sir Henry Hobart, the Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and local dignitary Sir Edward Bromley. She and her sister claimed that they had cast the death spell and had bewitched the elder child, his brother, and his sister. Further, they had cast spells that the Countess might not bear any more children. All this they had done because they were angry at being dismissed from service at the castle. The story they told was full of the traditional imagery of witchcraft, Margaret described how they had cast a death spell by using a glove stolen from young Henry. Her mother had stroked her familiar, a cat, with the glove, dipping it in hot water, and pierced it with scissors. This, they insisted, had brought the child to his death. 2 years later, another glove had been misused in this way, and Frances was similarly bewitched. They had confessed, and both Margaret and Philippia Flower were found guilty. They were hanged at Lincoln on March 12, 1618.
Have you ever heard of magic witch bottles? Why are magic witch bottles used for spells washing up on Texas beaches? This story is by Sarah Bahari, published November 27th, 2023. Fairly recent. Centuries ago, people believed evil spells could be thwarted with witch bottles, glass vessels stuffed with human hair, fingernail clippings, iron nails, and other tidbits. Even now, the eerie bottles wash up on Texas's Gulf Shore, extending from North Padre Island to Matagorda Island. The Corpus Christi-based Heart Research Institute, which is part of Texas A&M University, shared its latest find last week on Facebook. Just to be clear, Jace Tennell, Director of Community Engagement, can't tell what exactly is in this bottle because he declines to open it. Chicken. Over the years, Tunnel has found 8 or so of the bottles and never opened one. Somebody's after this guy. He has 5 on his backyard fence that his wife refuses to allow inside the house. Folks in certain cultures around the world put vegetation or other objects in a bottle, the Institute wrote on Facebook. They are counter-magical devices whose purpose is to draw in and trap harmful intentions directed at their owners. It is not known where the bottles come from, but Tennell said they likely originated in the Caribbean and South America.
Since the day I saw the cat at my door, so I came into you, sweet lady, answering your mystical call.
Here's another story from Mexico. This happened to my dad when he was younger. He and some friends decided to go camping. I forget where he said, but it was in the mountains outside of Mexico City. They stopped at a small town for supplies and then headed up the mountain. They set up their campsite and started a fire. Then one of their friends took out a little bottle of tequila he had swiped from his parents. It was, according to him, to help stay warm in a cold night. As they sat there by the fire, they started to see some strange lights in the other mountains. They were not cars because they were traveling up and down the mountain, and not as if they were following a road. They were too low to be planes. My dad and his friends watched for a while, and then things got scary. Everything got pitch black. Even with the campfire, you could barely see in front of you. They were gripped by an overwhelming sense of fear, a panic like he had never felt before. One of his friends grabbed a couple sticks and fashioned a crucifix out of them. They all gathered around it, praying before finishing off the tequila and passing out. In the morning, they decided to leave for home. They stopped at the small town for breakfast and began to tell the locals about what they had seen. One of them told the guys that they had been around witches, and the further away they appeared, the closer the witches were. The fear they all felt was meant to disorient them and make them easy prey. They were told that they were lucky to have made it back. Pretty creepy.
Prestige. Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch, yeah.
The Flowing Wells School Witch. In 1969, Flowing Wells High School in Tucson, Arizona, became entangled in one of the strangest witch hunt cases in history. A folklore lecturer from the local university visited this school and held a presentation that featured a description of what he said were traditional witches. Blonde hair, blue or green eyes, a widow's peak, a pointy left ear, and a penchant to wear a shade called Devil's Green. The description happened to match Ann Stewart, a tenured teacher in the school, almost perfectly. Of course, the students started joking about it. Stewart decided to let them have their fun. So when she was asked whether she really was a witch, her reply was simply, "What do you think?" This turned out to be a mistake. Rumors started spreading. At first, Stewart quite enjoyed her new image. Let me stop right here for a second. Of course, I have to interject and make this all, it's all about me. But one day at work, I dyed my hair black and straightened it and made it all crazy looking. And of course, I was wearing all black at the time. And I came into work, walking down the aisle there, and someone yelled out, "Hey, look, it's Jimmy Scissorhands." And instead of thinking I'd be upset about that, I embraced that name. I liked being called Jimmy Scissorhands. So apparently, this witch didn't mind being called a witch either. Thank you. So I was saying, at first, Stewart quite enjoyed her new image. She threw gasoline on the flames by giving her literature student a suggestion to find out about astrology, and even dressed up to play the part of a witch for a folklore lesson at the request of another teacher. However, she was just taking things in stride and never referred to herself as a witch. Unfortunately, the school district wasn't amused by her antics. In 1971, they fired her for passing herself as a witch and teaching witchcraft to the students. In a delicious twist, Stewart brought this particular witch trial to court herself. The judge ruled in her favor and ordered that she had to be immediately reinstated. So this particular witch hunt had a rare happy ending for this witch, who got to keep both her job and her reputation. Still, Stewart knows perfectly well that things would have gone very differently in the past. I surely would have been burned at the stake by now if this was 18th century Salem, she said about the ordeal.
This week's topic was sent in by our buddy Kyle Lovren. He was talking about watching a story about the Bell Witch, and I've heard of the Bell Witch, but I wasn't real awfully familiar with that story. So I was like, yeah, let's go. So here is the Bell Witch. The most savage and relentless poltergeist on record must surely be the Bell Witch, whose systematic persecution of the Bell family of Tennessee in the early 19th century stopped only at murder. Frank Smith tells the story. Thanks, Frank. It has become almost axiomatic that ghosts do no physical harm to those who experience them. The fear of ghosts, if it comes at all, is usually retrospective. Apparitions are frequently reported as being solid and normal, and it is only when they walk away through the wall or disappear as if switched off that the observer realizes what he has seen and becomes alarmed. Even the rambunctious poltergeist, whose activities include such apparently dangerous acts as throwing stones, smashing glass and crockery, and starting fires, causes little or no bodily damage to its victims. But there is one attested case of a supernatural power, which not only killed its victim, but apparently set out to do so with deliberate intent, and that was the so-called Bell Witch. The late Dr. Nander Fodder, a Freudian psychiatrist and pioneer of modern psychical research, termed it America's greatest ghost story. But if his conclusions are correct, it must also rank as one of the world's most bizarre murder mysteries. The malevolent power that laid siege to the homestead of John Bell and his family in Robertson County, Tennessee, USA, during the year 1817, lay totally outside the experience of that rural but rich community. A century and a quarter had elapsed since America's only serious outbreak of witchcraft mania died down at Salem, Massachusetts, and the Fox sisters of Hydesville, New York, founding daughters of modern spiritualism, lay more than 30 years in the future. The term poltergeist was unknown. Nevertheless, the Bells and their neighbors were Bible Belt Christians with a streak of superstition that paralleled that of their slaves, both black and white. See there? Consulted a village wise woman named Kate Batt. It was natural that they should call their trouble an old name. As Dr. Fodder put it, the witch, as a hunter was called, serves well as a descriptive term. Modern poltergeists, no matter how much mischief and destruction they wreak, stop short of murder. The Bell Witch did not, and it only ceased its activities after the death by poisoning of John Bell, the head of the household, whom it tortured and persecuted with a fury of unrelenting savagery. The phenomenon began in 1817 and petered out in the late spring of 1821, some months after the death of John Bell, although they did reoccur briefly 7 years later, apparently to fulfill a promise to one of the dead man's sons. During its reign, the witch attracted hordes of ghost hunters, most of them anxious to prove it a hoax. But these all met, according to contemporary records, with egregious defeat. Richard Williams Bell, a younger son of the family, wrote a record entitled Our Family Trouble in 1846, when he was 36 years old, and although he was only 10 when the witch ceased its activity, his account tied in well with later, more detailed records. One of these, published in 1867 by a Clarksville newspaper editor, M.V. Ingram, included interviews with all the surviving members of the family and some contemporary witnesses, as well as the testimony of the author, who had himself witnessed the outbreak as a child. Another was a document by John Bell, Jr., as related to his son, Dr. Joel Thomas Bell. The definitive version was given in 1934 by Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, son of Dr. Joel, who lectured on neurosurgery at the University of Nashville's medical department, was a consultant at Nashville City Hospital, and a prominent member of several national medical bodies. As a young medical student in 1888, Dr. Charles had interviewed his great-aunt, Elizabeth Betsy Bell, about her recollections. Then 83, she had in her youth been the center of the phenomena, and perhaps even an unwitting murderess. John Bell was a prosperous cotton plantation owner, well liked and respected by his neighbors and friends, who included General Andrew Jackson, later 7th President of the United States and a witness to the witch's activities. John and his wife, Lucy, lived in a large 2-story house with their 9 children. Their domestic servants and plantation hands were, of course, slaves, but as far as was possible under such conditions, the Bell children mingled with the hands on terms of easy friendliness. One of the most outgoing was Betsy Bell, a robust and apparently contented girl of 12 in 1817. The manifestations began in the form of knocks and raps on the walls and windows of the house, and increased in power and volume so that by the end of the year they were literally shaking the building to its foundation. Gnawing, scratching, and flapping sounds alternated with the rattle of invisible stones on the roof, the clattering of what sounded like heavy chains on the floor, and half-human gulping, choking, and lip-smacking noises. Then the force displayed its strength, pulling Richard Bell's hair so violently that it lifted him off his chair. He felt that the top of his head had been taken off, in great fright, and next Elizabeth was screaming in her room, and after that something was continually pulling at her hair after she retired to bed. Up to this point the family had kept their curious troubles to themselves, but now they let a close friend and neighbor, James Johnson, in on their secret. After witnessing the phenomena for himself, Johnson concluded that some intelligence lay behind them, and performed a brief exorcism that seemed to silence the Bell house for a while. But the witch returned, and with renewed vigor, slapping Betsy's cheeks until they were crimson and pulling her hair until she screamed with pain. John Bell and James Johnson called in more neighbors to form an investigating committee, partly to keep the tormented Betsy company, and partly to induce the witch to speak. Betsy spent a night away from home, but the trouble followed with her with the same severity, disturbing the family where she went, as it did at home. Nor were we anywise relieved, wrote Richard Bell later. The committee itself seems to have done more harm than good, inviting the force to rap on the wall, smack its mouth, etc., and in this way the phenomena were gradually developed. In fact, the development of the witch's voice seems to have come about under the urgings of the committee. At first it was low and inarticulate, a thin whistling sound, but gradually it turned into a weak, faltering whisper, and toward the end of its career it was loud and raucous. Unlike the other physical phenomena, which took place only after dark, although usually in lamplit rooms, the voice began to be heard both day and night, and came from any direction, and the voice grew in strength. So did the witch's violence. The blows were heard distinctly, like the open palm of a heavy hand, while the sting was keenly felt, and they were rained indiscriminately on anyone who happened to be around, but particularly on Betsy Bell and her father John. From the beginning, the force seemed to center on Betsy. As the voice developed, so the formerly robust girl began to suffer fainting fits and breathing difficulties that lasted up to half an hour at a time. During these attacks, the witch remained silent, but as soon as Betsy had recovered, it began to talk again. The obvious conclusion was that somehow Betsy was producing sounds by ventriloquism, but a doctor who visited the house laid his hands over her mouth at the time the voice was heard, and soon satisfied himself that she was in no way connected with these sounds. When the voice first developed, its utterances tended to be of a pious nature. It could reproduce word for word the Sunday sermons of the two local parsons, imitating their tones exactly. It sang beautifully and recited tracts from the Bible. Unfortunately, this was only a temporary phase. The voice soon began uttering obscenities, which were particularly distressing to a Bible Belt family. It also alarmed them by claiming to be Old Kate Bat's witch. The witch's ability to produce disgusting odors was demonstrated on several occasions. Once to local witness William Porter, when the witch got into bed with him and twisted his bedcloths off him, just like a boy would roll himself up in a quilt. Porter leaped out of bed and picked up the roll of bedcloths, intending to throw them into the fire. He said, "I discovered it was very weighty and smelled awful. I had not got halfway across the room before the luggage got so heavy and became so offensive that I was compelled to drop it on the floor and rush out of doors for a breath of fresh air. The odor was the most offensive stench I have ever smelled. Absolutely stifling." When Porter had recovered, however, he came back into the room and shook out the bedcloths, only to find the mysterious extra weight had vanished, and the stink had evaporated. Like many other poltergeists, the witch produced apports. During Lucy Bell's Bible study meetings, it took to dropping fresh fruit onto the table or into the laps of those present, and once, on Betsy's birthday, produced a large basket of oranges, bananas, grapes, and nuts, claiming those came from the West Indies. I brought them myself. But perhaps more in keeping with the witch's real nature was the scatological prank it played on Betsy Bell, when a local quack doctor offered her a potion to rid her of the power that tormented her. It was an unpleasant mixture, and the quack warned her that it would make her very ill. A copious evacuation of the stomach followed, the witch roaring with laughter at the surprise of the household when Betsy's vomit and excrement were found to be full of pins and needles. Richard Bell wrote, "They were real brass pins and needles. Mother kept them as long as she lived. I have seen the pins and needles myself. As a matter of course, Betsy could not have lived with such conglomeration in her stomach, and the only solution to the matter was that the witch dropped the pins and needles in the excrement unobserved." As time went on, the witch ceased its physical attacks on Betsy, but began to torment her emotionally. She had become engaged in her early teens to a local man, Joshua Gardner, to whom apparently everyone in the family and neighborhood thought she was ideally suited. But from the moment it developed the power of speech, the witch derided Joshua and advised against the match, whispering, "Please, Betsy Bell, don't have Joshua Gardner. Please, Betsy Bell, don't marry Joshua Gardner." Eventually it grew sharper in its remonstrations, making embarrassing revelations about the young couple's relationship in front of friends, and promising that Betsy would never know a moment's peace if she married Joshua. Eventually, quite hysterical and worn out in despair, she returned his engagement ring. But behind all these developments lay the witch's implacable hatred of John Bell, head of the family. From the start, the witch had sworn that it would torment old Jack Bell to the end of his life, and it made good on its threat. On December 19, 1820, John Bell was discovered in his bed in a deep stupor and could not be roused. His son John went to the medicine cabinet, but instead of the prescribed medicine, he found a smoky-looking vial, which was about 1/3 full of dark-colored liquid. The doctor arrived in time to hear the witch crowing, "It's useless for you to try and relieve old Jack. I have got him this time. He will never get up from that bed again." Asked about the strange medicine, it said, "I put it there and gave old Jack a big dose of it last night while he was fast asleep, which fixed him." Neither the doctor nor any member of the household could explain the presence of the mystery bottle, but a rather arbitrary test was made of its contents. The doctor dunked a straw into the mixture and wiped it onto the tongue of the Bells' pet cat. The cat jumped and whirled over a few times, stretched out, kicked, and died very quick. The doctor's next action would be unforgivable today, and even in his own time would have drawn suspicion had he done it in Europe. But his scientific training seems to have been overcast by the superstition of rural 19th century Tennessee. He threw the bottle into the fire, disposing of the witch's brew for good. The following morning, John Bell was found dead in his bed. The witch marked his passing by singing ribald songs at his funeral. After the death of John Bell, the energy of the witch seemed to dissipate. Its ribaldry vanished almost totally, and when questioned by Bell Jr., it gave introspective, if rather confused answers. Richard Bell, writing years afterward, surmised that, from the start, it had but two purposes, seemingly. One was the persecution of Father to the end of his life, the other the vile purpose of destroying the anticipated happiness that thrilled the heart of Betsy. So I guess she wasn't really a witch at all, just some kind of weird demon manifestation. But it provided a good topic this week for us. Creepy witch stories. If you've got a show idea, or you want to be a guest on the show, or you just want to send us some insults or whatever, you can do so by writing to indarkplacespod at hotmail.com. Hey, how about one more creepy witch story? Jimmy has one more for you.
God, that's what he calls me, 'cause that's what I am. That's what I am.
You know, a woman was arrested in 1976, as recent as 1976, for witchcraft. This is called alleged witchcraft in North Carolina. Out of Morganton, North Carolina. A Morganton woman who allegedly correctly predicted the day another woman would die has been charged with violating North Carolina's witchcraft law. Catherine Carpenter, 22, filed the charge against Joanne Denton, claiming Mrs. Denton predicted during a seance, March 20th, that Mrs. Carpenter's mother, Dorothy Elizabeth Ramsey, would die April 10th. Mrs. Ramsey, 38, died last Saturday on that date. An autopsy report showed a high level of alcohol and drugs in the body, which appeared to be the cause of death. I think this lady should be stopped because it works on your nerves to be told when you are going to die, and when that day comes it really gets you, said Mrs. Carpenter. Mrs. Carpenter said her mother was told at a seance that she would die in a car accident and was involved in an auto accident the week of her death. Although uninjured, she said Miss Ramsey was extremely nervous afterwards. She said her mother already was under a doctor's care for a nervous condition, and after the accident, and knowing of her predicted death, had been taking pills to calm herself. I believe the prediction worked on her nerves, said Mrs. Carpenter. She just kept taking pills and taking pills and taking pills to calm herself down. Mrs. Denton allegedly made the prediction at a seance in her home, supposedly held for the purpose of speaking to Buddy Carpenter, Catherine's husband, who died October 10th, 1975.
When you're sitting on a throne, no one calls you honey.
that's just about going to do it this week. Thank you, Jimmy Scissorhands. Thank you, Kyle Lovern. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again right here next week. God bless you.